The night breathes through the corridors of stone like the exhalation of sleeping gods, carrying with it the scent of lotus blossoms and the distant murmur of the Nile as it flows eternal past the temple walls. Here, in this sacred space where shadows dance between pillars carved with the faces of deities whose names grow fainter with each passing season, a young man keeps vigil in the manner of his fathers and their fathers before them, maintaining the ancient rhythm of prayer and protection that has sustained this holy place for countless generations. Khaemwaset stands motionless in the outer courtyard, his linen kilt stirring slightly in the warm wind that carries whispers from the desert beyond the fertile valley. At 22 years, his body bears the lean strength that comes from years of temple service, his dark skin burnished by countless hours beneath the sun of Ra, his eyes holding depths that seem older than his youth should permit. The bronze brazier before him flickers with flames that cast writhing shadows across hieroglyphs that tell stories of creation and destruction, of gods who once walked among mortals and spoke with voices that shook the foundations of the earth. Tonight feels different from the 1,000 nights that have preceded it, charged with significance that he cannot name yet cannot ignore. The silence that surrounds him carries weight beyond mere absence of sound, a quality of listening that suggests the very stones of the temple are straining to hear something that may never come again. Even the sacred ibises that normally call from the marshes beyond the temple walls have fallen quiet, as if they too sense that this darkness holds mysteries that daylight will struggle to illuminate. The temple of Khnum rises around him like a mountain crafted by divine hands, its limestone blocks fitted with precision that speaks of knowledge passed down through dynasties when Egypt commanded the respect and tribute of nations whose names are now whispered only by scholars and scribes. Each stone bears the marks of chisels guided by artisans who understood that they were not merely shaping rock, but creating vessels for the divine presence that would sanctify this ground for generations beyond counting. The great columns that support the hypostyle hall tower above him, like papyrus plants frozen in eternal stone, their capitals carved in the likeness of lotus buds that will never open, never wither, never know the passage of seasons that marks the mortality of all living things. Khaemwaset's fingers trace the polished surface of his staff, feeling the smooth wood that has absorbed the oils from countless hands that held it during nights of vigilance stretching back through centuries of unbroken service. His grandfather's grandfather had grasped this same staff while standing guard against tomb robbers and hostile spirits, while watching for signs that the gods might send through dreams or omens to guide the faithful in times of uncertainty. The knowledge that his hands rest where so many others have rested brings both comfort and burden, connection to a lineage that demands he prove worthy of the trust that has been passed down to him like sacred fire carried from altar to altar. The sound of water lapping against the temple's foundation stones creates a rhythm that matches his heartbeat, the eternal percussion of river against shore that has marked time since the first pharaoh raised his crook and flail to unite the two lands under divine authority. Beyond the walls, the Nile flows northward toward the delta, where it spreads like fingers reaching into the Mediterranean, carrying with it the life-giving silt that transforms desert into garden, death into abundance, year after year in cycles that seemed as reliable as the rising of the sun, until recent seasons began to whisper of changes that no priest could adequately explain. His parents had named him for Khaemwaset the Great, son of Rameses, prince and high priest, who had restored ancient monuments and rekindled the flames of traditional worship during times when foreign influences threatened to dilute the purity of Egyptian wisdom. That legendary namesake had lived in an age when pharaohs still commanded the reverence of their people without question. when the gods spoke clearly through oracle and dream, when Ma'at ruled the land with justice that flowed as surely as the river that sustained all life in the valley. To bear such a name in these diminished times feels both honor and mockery, reminder of greatness that may never return and challenge to prove worthy of heritage that seems increasingly impossible to maintain. The education that prepared him for temple service had begun before he could form complete sentences, starting with the proper way to approach the sacred precincts with clean body and pure heart, continuing through the memorization of prayers and hymns that connected worshippers to divine forces that governed everything from the flooding of the Nile to the movement of stars across the night sky. His teachers had been men grown old in service to the gods, their voices weathered by decades of chanting invocations that once seemed to echo through the heavens and return laden with blessings that enriched both temple and kingdom. Under their patient guidance, he had learned to read the hieroglyphs that covered every surface of the temple interior, understanding that these were not mere decorations, but living words that maintained the cosmic order through their very presence on the sacred stones. Each symbol carried power that could be activated through proper pronunciation and intent, connecting the earthly realm to divine spheres, where gods deliberated the fate of mortals according to principles that transcended human understanding. To read these texts was to participate in creation itself, to add his voice to the chorus that sang the world into continued existence through acts of worship and remembrance. The preparation of offerings had taught him to handle sacred objects with reverence that acknowledged their role as bridges between human need and divine abundance. Bread and beer, incense and flowers, precious oils and gleaming gold, all had to be arranged according to patterns that reflected heavenly order, while appealing to the appetites and preferences that gods were said to share with mortals despite their elevated nature. The smallest error in placement or proportion could disrupt the delicate balance that encouraged divine favor, while protecting against the chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm the ordered world that civilization had so carefully constructed. Tonight, as he stands in the courtyard, where moonlight transforms familiar columns into mysterious forms that seem to shift and breathe with their own hidden life, Khaemwaset finds himself remembering his first night of solitary watch, when the responsibility of protecting sacred space from both physical and spiritual threats had fallen upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight and shadow. The elder priest who had trained him, Amenhotep the Wise, had spoken words that echo in his memory with increasing urgency as the hours pass and dawn remains distant. The gods test their servants not with grand challenges that call forth heroic response, but with quiet moments when faith must sustain itself without external confirmation, when duty must be performed despite uncertainty about its ultimate purpose or effect. The brazier flames dance higher as wind gusts through the temple complex, their light revealing details in the carved reliefs that daylight renders in flat certainty, but darkness transforms into scenes of living drama. Here the pharaoh makes offerings to Khnum, the ram-headed creator god who shaped humanity on his potter's wheel from the clay of the sacred river. There, the goddess Nith draws her bow to protect Egypt from the forces of chaos that eternally threaten the ordered world. These images, repeated countless times throughout the temple, with variations that reflect the skill and inspiration of different artists across different dynasties, create a visual theology that teaches through beauty what words alone cannot convey. Yet tonight, these familiar scenes seem to watch him with expressions that he has never noticed before. Their painted eyes holding depths that suggest awareness beyond artistic achievement. The god-kings who stride across these walls in eternal triumph appear somehow diminished, their crowns less radiant, their gestures less commanding than memory insists they should be. Even mighty Khnum himself seems to turn his ram's head away from offerings that once brought visible blessing, but now disappear into silence that grows deeper with each passing season. The lotus pools that reflect starlight in their still surfaces remind Khaemwaset of the cosmological myths he learned as a child. Stories of creation emerging from primordial waters that contained all possibilities within their dark depths. According to the ancient teachings, existence began when the first lotus flower bloomed upon the surface of these cosmic waters, its petals opening to reveal the young sun god who spoke light into being and established the foundations upon which all subsequent order would rest. These pools, fed by channels that connect them to the sacred river, serve as earthly reminders of that primal moment when divine will transformed emptiness into abundance. Standing beside one of these pools, he can see his reflection wavering in water that captures fragments of stars and holds them like scattered diamonds against dark velvet. The face that looks back at him bears the features that mark him as descendant of the people who built this temple and countless others along the river's length. The strong jaw and aquiline nose, the large dark eyes that seem designed for contemplating mysteries that daylight cannot penetrate. Yet there is something in that reflected gaze that troubles him, a quality of questioning that his teachers would have recognized as dangerous to the certainty that effective service required. The night air carries sounds that speak of life continuing beyond the temple walls, despite the cosmic uncertainties that plague those who think too deeply about the meaning of recent changes in familiar patterns. Farmers sleep in mud brick houses beside fields where grain grows tall in the fertile silt that the river has deposited during its annual flood. Fishermen repair their nets while their boats rock gently at wooden piers that extend into water flowing northward with the same patience it has shown since the beginning of time. Children dream dreams that carry them into adventures where gods still walk among mortals and magic flows as freely as water from an eternal spring. Yet beneath these comforting sounds of ordinary existence, Khaemwaset detects undertones that speak of changes that no amount of traditional wisdom seems capable of addressing. The voices of nightbirds carry notes that seem somehow altered, as if they sing songs learned from sources that no longer provide clear guidance. The wind that moves through the palm fronds speaks in languages that his education did not prepare him to interpret. Whispers that hint at knowledge that may be essential for survival in times that are approaching, like shadows cast by storms that have not yet appeared above the horizon. His staff feels heavier in his hands as the night deepens, its familiar weight transformed into something that seems to anchor him to a duty that may outlive its purpose, a role that requires him to maintain rituals whose effectiveness depends upon divine presence that grows more difficult to perceive with each passing month. The bronze head of the staff, carved in the likeness of the Ankh that symbolizes life eternal, reflects flame light with a glow that seems dimmer than it should be, as if even sacred symbols are losing their capacity to channel the forces they were designed to focus and direct. Walking slowly along the processional way that leads from the outer courtyard toward the Holy of Holies, where the god's statue rests in darkness more profound than any earthly night, Khaemwaset feels the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, like the stones of a pyramid built to preserve secrets that may no longer be worth the effort required to protect them. Each step echoes through halls where pharaohs once walked in confidence that their authority derived from sources more reliable than human ambition, where high priests conducted ceremonies that brought visible blessing to land and people alike. The sacred bark that once carried the god's image in processions through the streets of the nearby city rests now on wooden supports in a side chamber, its golden decorations tarnished despite careful maintenance, its sail furled in permanent stillness that speaks of journeys that may never be resumed. During the great festivals of his childhood, this vessel had seemed to pulse with divine life as it was borne on the shoulders of priests, while crowds of worshippers threw flowers in its path and called out prayers that seemed to rise toward heaven on wings of hope and certainty. Now the bark waits in silence that has lasted through 3 seasons of festivals that attracted fewer participants and generated less enthusiasm with each repetition. The songs that once filled the air with melodious praise have been replaced by whispered conversations about taxes and foreign soldiers, about omens that seem to multiply without clarification, about dreams that bring fear rather than comfort to those who experience them. The very air within the temple seems thinner somehow, less capable of sustaining the presence that once made these stones vibrate with power that could be felt in bones and blood. The memory of his father's voice echoes through the corridors of his mind, as clearly as if the old man stood beside him in this moonlit courtyard, sharing wisdom gained through 40 years of temple service that had witnessed the slow transformation of worship from joyous celebration to increasingly desperate petition. Nabank the Faithful had been a priest of the old school, trained by men who could still remember when the gods answered prayers with signs that left no room for doubt. When healing came to those who approached the sacred statues with pure hearts and proper offerings, when the Nile's flood arrived with precision that made planting and harvest as predictable as the rising of the sun. "Remember, my son," his father had said during those final weeks when age and illness had confined him to a simple bed in the priest's quarters. "That doubt is the enemy of divine connection. Yet certainty without understanding is the path to spiritual blindness. The gods speak to those who listen with hearts open enough to receive messages that may not match what tradition has taught us to expect." These words had seemed cryptic when first spoken, but tonight they resonate with meaning that brings both comfort and unease as Khaemwaset contemplates the silence that has settled over the temple, like dust accumulating on surfaces that were once polished daily by hands that served with unwavering devotion. His earliest memories reach back to childhood mornings when he would accompany his father through the daily rituals that awakened the god from divine sleep and prepared the sacred presence to receive the prayers and offerings that sustained the cosmic order. The statue of Khnum, carved from black granite that seemed to absorb light while radiating presence that could be felt throughout the inner sanctuary, had dominated those early experiences with authority that required no explanation or justification. The ram's head, crowned with tall plumes, had gazed down at the child with eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom accumulated across millennia of answered prayers and granted blessings. The ritual of opening the shrine had followed patterns established by the first priests who served in this temple, each gesture and word prescribed by tradition that claimed divine origin and demanded perfect execution. Holy water drawn from the sacred well, incense burned in bronze censers that had blackened with age and use, prayers spoken in the classical language that preserved the exact formulations through which gods preferred to be addressed. All had combined to create an atmosphere in which the boundary between human and divine dissolved into communion that transformed both worshipper and deity through mutual recognition and exchange. During those childhood years, Khaemwaset had accepted the reality of divine presence as naturally as he accepted the warmth of sunlight or the wetness of river water, experiencing the god's attention as something as real and tangible as his father's hand upon his shoulder or his mother's voice calling him home for the evening meal. The temple had pulsed with life that extended far beyond the physical activities of priests and servants, its stones seeming to breathe with rhythms that matched those of the human hearts that had poured decades of devotion into maintaining the sacred spaces where heaven and earth could meet in mutual understanding. His mother, Isetnofret the Beloved, had served the goddess Nith in the women's quarters of the temple complex. Her days spent weaving linen cloth of extraordinary fineness that would serve to clothe the divine statues during the great festivals when gods processed through the streets to visit one another in ceremonies that renewed the bonds between different aspects of the divine nature. Her hands, stained permanently blue from the dyes she used to create patterns of symbolic significance, had worked with skill that seemed guided by inspiration that transcended mere human training and practice. "The goddess speaks through the thread," she would tell her young son as he watched her work at the great loom that dominated the weaving room, where shafts of sunlight illuminated floating particles of cotton and linen that danced in the air like visible prayers. Each strand must be placed with intention that honors the pattern while remaining flexible enough to accommodate adjustments that divine will may require as the work progresses. These lessons in patience and attention to detail had shaped his understanding of how human effort could become vehicle for divine expression when undertaken with proper attitude and sufficient skill. The festivals of his youth had been occasions of community celebration that united the entire district in acknowledgement of divine blessing and protection that made civilized life possible in a world where chaos always threatened to overwhelm the ordered beauty that generations of human effort had created along the river's fertile banks. During the festival of Khnum, when the god's bark made its processional journey from temple to temple, while crowds of worshippers followed its path through streets decorated with fresh flowers and colorful banners, the very air had seemed charged with electricity that made participants feel connected to sources of power and meaning that transcended ordinary human experience. Those processions had been theater in which the entire community participated, each person playing a role that connected individual life to cosmic drama where good and evil, order and chaos, light and darkness engaged in eternal struggle whose outcome depended upon human willingness to support divine forces through worship, obedience, and sacrifice. The children who scattered flower petals in the god's path, the musicians who provided accompaniment for ancient hymns, the dancers who moved with grace that seemed to embody divine joy, all had been essential participants in ceremonies that renewed the world through collective affirmation of values that made civilized existence possible. Yet even during those years of apparent divine favor, subtle signs had pointed toward changes that only became visible in retrospect. Warnings that might have prepared the community for transitions that now seem to accelerate with each passing season. The crowds that gathered for festivals had begun to include increasing numbers of foreign merchants and soldiers whose presence diluted the traditional purity that proper ceremony required. The hymns that had once been sung with unanimous enthusiasm had started to include variations that reflected different traditions and interpretations, creating disharmony that weakened the magical effectiveness that unity of voice and intention had always provided. The flooding of the Nile, that most reliable of natural rhythms upon which all Egyptian life depended, had begun to show irregularities that made farmers nervous and priests uncertain about the reliability of agricultural cycles that had sustained the kingdom since the first pharaoh united the two lands under divine authority. Some years brought floods that arrived too early or too late, too high or too low, creating crop failures that strained the elaborate distribution systems that kept entire populations fed during seasons when the river could not be relied upon to provide its customary abundance. Khaemwaset's training in the sacred mathematics that governed temple construction and astronomical observation had revealed additional sources of concern that traditional wisdom seemed unable to address adequately. The star charts that guided religious ceremonies and agricultural decisions had begun to require adjustments that suggested either human error in previous calculations or actual changes in celestial patterns that no earthly authority could influence or control. The carefully maintained calendar that synchronized religious observances with cosmic events showed gaps and inconsistencies that made scheduling of important ceremonies increasingly problematic. The theological education that prepared him for priestly service had emphasized the eternal nature of divine order and the reliability of cosmic patterns that provided framework for human understanding and action. Yet his own observations, conducted with instruments and methods passed down through generations of temple astronomers, suggested that change rather than constancy might be the fundamental characteristic of existence, that what previous generations had experienced as permanent might actually represent temporary arrangements that could be modified or terminated according to divine purposes that mortal minds could not adequately comprehend. Standing now in the courtyard, where shadows cast by moonlight create patterns that shift and change with the movement of clouds across star-filled sky, he finds himself questioning assumptions that had seemed as solid as the temple foundations themselves, wondering whether the silence that surrounds him represents divine displeasure with human failures or divine absence that reflects larger changes in cosmic arrangements that govern the relationship between earthly and heavenly realms. The bronze mirror that hangs in the shrine room, polished to perfect reflectivity through daily attention that has continued even as other aspects of temple maintenance have begun to show signs of reduced resources and diminished enthusiasm, seems to reflect images that include more than physical reality should contain. During his evening inspections of the sacred spaces, Khaemwaset has noticed that the mirror sometimes shows movements that correspond to no earthly activity, shadows that fall in directions that defy explanation, faces that belong to no one present yet appear with clarity that suggests actual presence rather than mere imagination. These unsettling observations accumulate in his memory like sediment deposited by floodwaters, creating layers of doubt and uncertainty that undermine the confidence that effective priestly service traditionally required. Each anomaly might be explained individually through reference to fatigue, stress, or misinterpretation of ordinary phenomena under conditions that encourage imagination to override careful observation. Collectively, however, they suggest patterns that point toward transformations in the fundamental nature of reality that no amount of traditional training had prepared him to understand or address. The sacred texts that he studies during quiet hours of the night shift, when the temple sleeps around him like a great stone organism breathing slowly through passages carved by wind and rain across centuries of exposure to elements that gradually wear away even the hardest stone, contain prophecies and warnings that seem increasingly relevant to contemporary circumstances despite their composition in remote antiquity. References to times when gods would withdraw their presence from earthly realms, when temples would stand empty despite continued human service, when the very foundations of order would require renegotiation between divine and mortal authorities. These prophetic passages, written in hieroglyphs whose meaning had seemed purely academic when first encountered during his formal education, now pulse with immediate relevance that makes their ancient warnings seem like messages composed specifically for his generation. The descriptions of cosmic transitions that would require humanity to develop new forms of relationship with divine forces match too closely the circumstances that surround him tonight for their similarity to be attributed to mere coincidence or wishful interpretation of ambiguous language. The incense that burns continuously in braziers throughout the temple complex carries prayers and petitions upward on smoke that seems to dissipate more quickly than it once did, as if the heavenly realms toward which human supplication has always been directed have become more distant or less accessible to earthly communication. The aromatic woods and resins that create this sacred smoke have been harvested from the same sources and prepared according to the same methods that have served for generations. Yet their effectiveness in creating spiritual atmosphere that encourages divine attention seems measurably reduced. Walking through chambers where generations of priests have maintained vigil through thousands of nights similar to this one, yet somehow fundamentally different in their spiritual tenor, Khaemwaset feels the weight of inheritance that includes both privilege and responsibility that may prove impossible to fulfill adequately. The knowledge that has been passed down to him represents the accumulated wisdom of centuries of human effort to understand and serve divine purposes. Yet this knowledge seems increasingly inadequate to address situations that previous generations never encountered, and for which traditional solutions provide no effective guidance. The sound of his sandaled feet against stone floors creates echoes that seem to carry farther than the physical dimensions of the temple should permit, suggesting that sound itself behaves differently in spaces where divine presence has grown uncertain. These echoes return to him transformed, carrying harmonics that speak of emptiness, expanding beyond the merely physical absence of people. Emptiness that reaches into spiritual dimensions where connection between human and divine has traditionally flourished, but now shows signs of attenuating toward complete dissolution. The first pale suggestion of dawn begins to touch the eastern horizon as Khaemwaset completes his circuit of the temple complex, his staff clicking against stone worn smooth by countless feet that have walked these same paths in service to the same god through centuries of Egyptian greatness that now seems to be settling into twilight that may last longer than any single lifetime can encompass. The night that began with uncertainty and proceeded through revelation approaches its conclusion with a clarity that brings neither comfort nor despair, but rather the profound acceptance that comes when understanding transcends the need for emotional response to circumstances beyond human control. Standing once more in the courtyard, where lotus pools reflect the growing light, like mirrors positioned to capture the first rays of Ra's bark, as it begins its daily journey across the sky that arches over Egypt like a blue ceiling painted with gold stars. He feels within himself a transformation that matches the larger changes taking place in the world around him. The young man who began this vigil with questions born of anxiety and doubt has become someone capable of holding uncertainty without being overwhelmed by it, of serving faithfully despite absence of the divine confirmations that previous generations had learned to expect as natural accompaniment to properly performed devotion. The gods have not abandoned Egypt, he realizes with sudden clarity that illuminates his understanding like sunlight breaking through clouds that have obscured the landscape for so long that observers had begun to forget what clear vision could reveal. Rather, they are teaching their people to develop new forms of relationship that do not depend upon constant external validation, new ways of maintaining cosmic order that draw upon internal resources that have always been present, but rarely tested by circumstances that required their activation. The silence that had seemed so ominous during the darker hours of night now reveals itself as space for growth rather than absence of divine attention, opportunity for human consciousness to mature beyond dependence upon miraculous interventions that had sustained earlier stages of spiritual development, but might actually impede the evolution toward greater autonomy that divine wisdom may have always intended as the ultimate goal of religious education and practice. His father's words echo in memory with new resonance, as dawn light transforms the temple from mysterious shadow realm into familiar place where daily tasks await completion according to routines that connect this morning to all the mornings that preceded it, and all those that will follow as long as human devotion continues to find expression through ritual that honors divine presence regardless of the forms through which that presence chooses to manifest or conceal itself. The bronze brazier in the courtyard continues to burn with flames that seem brighter now against the growing daylight, their warmth radiating outward to encompass not merely physical space, but spiritual dimensions where doubt and faith, question and answer, human effort and divine response merge into unity that transcends the artificial distinctions that analytical thinking tends to impose upon experiences that can only be understood through direct participation in their unfolding mystery. Khaemwaset approaches the sacred pool where lotus blossoms float upon water that captures sky and stars, heaven and earth, past and future, in reflections that change with each slight movement of air across surfaces that maintain their essential stillness despite constant minor variations in their appearance. Kneeling beside water that has been sanctified by centuries of prayer and offering, he sees his own face reflected with clarity that reveals not only physical features but something of the inner transformation that the night has accomplished through its patient instruction in forms of wisdom that cannot be transmitted through words alone. The face that looks back at him from water blessed by divine presence that continues, despite changes in its mode of expression, bears the marks of understanding that has been purchased through willingness to remain present during hours when presence itself became the primary form of spiritual practice. His eyes hold depths that were not there when darkness first settled over the temple and its surrounding grounds, depths that reflect capacity for holding mystery without demanding immediate resolution, for serving faithfully without requiring constant reassurance about the value or effectiveness of service rendered in circumstances that provide few external confirmations of success. Rising slowly from beside the pool where morning light creates patterns that dance and shift like hieroglyphs, written by divine hand in language that speaks directly to consciousness, prepared to receive instruction through beauty rather than argument, through presence rather than explanation, through acceptance rather than resistance to changes that may ultimately serve purposes larger than individual understanding can encompass. Khaemwaset feels ready to begin another day of service that will differ from all previous days only in his capacity to perform it without attachment to outcomes that lie beyond his control or influence. The statue of Khnum in its inner shrine continues to gaze outward with stone eyes that see everything and reveal nothing, maintaining the divine mystery that preserves space for human growth toward understanding that must be earned through patient cultivation, rather than granted as reward for proper performance of external rituals. The god's presence fills the temple not through miraculous manifestations that overwhelm doubt with undeniable evidence, but through subtler influences that work within human consciousness to develop capacities for wisdom that can function effectively even when divine support operates according to principles that mortal minds cannot fully comprehend. The morning ritual begins, as it has begun for countless centuries, with water drawn from the sacred well and incense prepared from aromatic woods that fill the temple with fragrance that carries prayers upward on smoke that rises toward heaven regardless of whether immediate responses descend to earth in forms that human expectations have learned to recognize as signs of divine attention and approval. The familiar gestures acquire new meaning as they are performed by hands that have learned to serve without attachment to specific results, to offer devotion as gift rather than transaction, to maintain faith as practice rather than mere belief that requires constant confirmation from external sources. The hymns that rise from his throat as he performs the ancient ceremonies of awakening the god carry notes that seem to harmonize with sounds beyond human hearing, creating music that bridges earthly and celestial realms through human voice that has learned to serve as instrument for divine expression, regardless of whether that expression produces immediate effects that can be measured and evaluated according to conventional standards of religious effectiveness. As sunlight streams through temple windows to illuminate hieroglyphs that cover every surface with sacred texts composed by scribes who understood that writing could become form of prayer when undertaken with proper intention and sufficient skill. Khaemwaset recognizes that his role as guardian encompasses more than protection of physical structures and material treasures. He serves as keeper of spiritual possibilities that may lie dormant for generations before circumstances arise that allow their full manifestation in human experience. The temple around him stands not as monument to past greatness that can never be recovered, but as seed that contains potential for future flowering that may surpass anything previously achieved through human cooperation with divine purposes that operate according to rhythms that extend far beyond the brief spans of individual lives, or even entire civilizations. The stones that seem so solid and permanent actually represent temporary arrangements of eternal substances that will eventually be reconfigured into forms that serve new purposes while preserving essential principles that make spiritual development possible under any circumstances that consciousness may encounter. The Nile continues its eternal flow northward toward the delta where fresh water meets salt in marriage that creates new forms of life through union of elements that seem opposite but actually complement each other in ways that produce abundance beyond what either could achieve alone. This daily movement of river towards sea embodies cosmic principles that govern all transformation, all growth, all evolution toward greater complexity and deeper understanding of unity that underlies apparent diversity in forms through which divine creativity expresses itself in endless variation that never exhausts the fundamental source from which all manifestation emerges. Standing in the doorway of the temple, as morning light reveals the familiar landscape of fields and palm trees, mud brick houses and wooden boats. The ordinary world where people live and work and die while pursuing purposes that connect their individual lives to larger patterns of meaning that extend across generations and cultures toward understanding that transcends all temporary forms, while finding expression through each particular example of consciousness that learns to serve something greater than its own immediate concerns and desires. The staff in his hands no longer feels heavy with burden, but light with possibility. Instrument for service that draws its effectiveness not from external authority, but from internal alignment with purposes that operate through human willing cooperation, rather than demanding blind obedience to commands that override individual understanding and choice. The bronze ankh that caps the staff catches morning sunlight and reflects it back toward heaven in acknowledgement that light given returns to its source, multiplied through contact with consciousness that has learned to serve as clear mirror for divine radiance. Khaemwaset the Guardian takes his place among those who serve as bridges between worlds, maintaining connection between human and divine realms through presence that requires no miraculous confirmation to validate its essential function in cosmic order that includes both visible and invisible dimensions of existence. His vigil continues not because duty demands it, but because love chooses it, not because tradition requires it, but because understanding recognizes it as natural expression of consciousness that has discovered its true nature through willingness to remain present during night hours, when presence itself becomes the primary form of spiritual practice. The temple breathes around him with rhythms that match those of the river and the seasons, the stars and the human heart, all participating in cosmic symphony that plays continuously, though human ears do not always possess the clarity required to hear its eternal melodies. He listens now with inner hearing that has been refined through hours of silence that taught him to distinguish between sounds that arise from divine sources and those that emerge from merely human imagination or desire. As the sun climbs higher and the day begins to unfold, according to patterns that connect this morning to all mornings, while allowing for infinite variation in detail that prevents existence from becoming mechanical repetition rather than living participation in creative process that continues to generate new possibilities for beauty and meaning. Khaemwaset completes his transformation from questioner to servant, from seeker to finder, from one who demands answers to one who embodies responses that transcend verbal formulation. The gods have spoken, not through voices that echo in temple chambers or signs that appear in natural phenomena, but through the inner changes that patient service cultivates in consciousness, that learns to receive divine teaching through direct experience, rather than requiring external confirmation that might actually interfere with subtler forms of instruction that operate through silence rather than sound, through absence rather than presence, through questions rather than answers. The night ends as it began, with mystery intact and service required, yet everything has changed through transformation that occurred not in external circumstances, but in the quality of awareness that encounters those circumstances with understanding that has been deepened through willingness to remain present during hours when presence itself became the path toward wisdom that no amount of study alone could provide. Egypt continues its ancient conversation with eternity, and Khaemwaset has learned to serve as one of the voices through which that conversation finds expression in human experience that honors both divine transcendence and human responsibility, to serve as conscious participants in cosmic order that includes and transcends all temporary forms while finding its eternal fulfillment through love that requires no reason beyond its own perfect nature. Years flow like the Nile itself, carrying away the familiar contours of youth, while depositing new sediments of understanding in the delta of Khaemwaset's consciousness. At 37, he moves through the temple with the measured grace of one whose body has learned to embody the rhythms of sacred service, his footsteps creating patterns that connect each dawn to those that preceded it, while leaving space for variations that prevent ritual from hardening into mere repetition. The staff that once felt heavy with inherited burden now rests lightly in hands that have discovered how to channel authority without grasping it, how to maintain traditions while allowing them to evolve according to needs that each generation must recognize and address. The temple complex shows signs of the transformations that have touched every aspect of Egyptian life during these years of gradual transition from one form of civilization to another. The eastern wing, once bustling with scribes who maintained correspondence with temples throughout the kingdom, stands partially closed, its papyrus archives carefully sealed against dust and dampness, while awaiting times that may provide resources for their proper maintenance. 3 of the smaller shrines have been shuttered, their statues wrapped in linen and stored in chambers where they wait like sleeping gods for circumstances that might allow their return to active service. Yet what strikes visitors most profoundly is not the evidence of decline, but the quality of presence that continues to emanate from spaces that remain in active use. The main sanctuary pulses with spiritual intensity that seems to concentrate rather than diminish as external support dwindles, as if divine energy responds to scarcity by revealing depths that abundance had kept hidden. The daily rituals continue with precision that transforms necessity into art, each gesture refined by years of practice that have discovered how limitations can become teachers of essential, rather than merely conventional forms of worship. Khaemwaset finds himself increasingly called upon to serve as teacher for younger men who arrive at the temple seeking something that the changing world outside these walls no longer provides. They come from families whose traditional occupations have been disrupted by foreign administrators who prefer their own methods and personnel, from villages where ancient festivals have been replaced by celebrations that honor different gods under different names, from lives that have lost connection to sources of meaning that their ancestors took for granted as naturally as breathing. These young seekers possess hunger that reminds him of his own youthful questions, yet they bring with them experiences of dislocation that his generation could barely imagine. They have grown up in a world where Egyptian and foreign, traditional and innovative, sacred and secular exist in combinations that require new forms of wisdom to navigate successfully. Their education in classical learning has been supplemented by exposure to ideas and practices that originate beyond the borders of the ancient kingdom, creating minds that must synthesize rather than simply inherit the spiritual resources they will need for effective living. Among them, young Khenti shows particular promise, his quick intelligence balanced by patience, unusual in one who has experienced only 20 years of life's alternating gifts and challenges. He arrived at the temple 6 seasons ago, referred by a village priest who recognized that the boy's gifts required cultivation that rural circumstances could not provide. His family had served local shrines for generations, but recent administrative changes had reduced their responsibilities while increasing their need to find alternative sources of support for themselves and their dependents. "Master," Khenti asks during one of their evening sessions on the temple roof, where they study star charts that map celestial movements with accuracy accumulated across centuries of careful observation. "How do we maintain connection to gods who seem to speak differently than they spoke to our fathers? I memorize the traditional prayers, yet when I recite them, the words feel hollow in my mouth, like vessels that no longer contain what they were designed to hold." Khaemwaset pauses in his tracing of constellation patterns across papyrus that preserves astronomical knowledge for future generations, who may need to rediscover what contemporary circumstances have made difficult to maintain. The question touches the heart of challenges that every thinking priest of this generation must address, issues that cannot be resolved through reference to established precedents because the conditions they address have no true precedent in recorded experience. "The gods speak," he replies slowly, choosing words that honor both tradition and the transformations that tradition must undergo to remain alive rather than merely preserved. But their voice changes according to what human consciousness has become capable of hearing. In previous generations, divine communication took forms that matched the spiritual development of those times. Now we must learn to recognize divine presence in silences that once would have been interpreted as absence, in questions that once would have demanded immediate answers. The roof of the temple provides vantage point from which the relationship between sacred and ordinary space becomes visible as complementary, rather than competitive aspects of existence that serves purposes larger than either can achieve alone. Below them, the city continues its nightly settling into rest that prepares its inhabitants for tomorrow's labors and opportunities. Cooking fires create points of warm light that mark households where families gather to share food and stories, laughter and concerns that connect individual lives to the continuing human conversation about what makes existence meaningful despite its inevitable difficulties and uncertainties. Beyond the city boundaries, agricultural areas spread toward horizons where desert meets cultivation in boundaries that shift with seasons and human effort, reminding observers that civilization exists through constant negotiation between human intention and natural forces that operate according to principles more fundamental than any social arrangement can override or permanently modify. The Nile reflects starlight, as it has done since before human memory began its work of preserving experience in forms that could be transmitted across generations, its eternal flow providing rhythm that underlies all temporary variations in human affairs. "Watch the stars," Khaemwaset instructs, pointing toward constellations that wheel slowly across night sky in patterns that connect this moment to all moments when consciousness has looked upward, seeking guidance from sources beyond earthly understanding. Notice how they maintain their relationships to each other while participating in movements that carry them through cycles too vast for single lifetimes to encompass completely. This is how we must learn to serve, faithful to essential connections, while remaining responsive to larger rhythms that require our participation without demanding our complete comprehension. Kenti follows his teacher's gesture toward celestial display that transforms darkness into revelation, his young eyes trained by months of instruction to recognize significance in arrangements that untrained vision would dismiss as mere decoration of night sky. The education he receives encompasses more than technical knowledge about astronomical calculation and ritual procedure, extending into cultivation of perception that can discover divine communication in phenomena that speak through beauty and pattern, rather than through words that demand verbal response. The constellation of the bull, Khaemwaset continues, his voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from decades of patient observation, appears to maintain the same form year after year, yet careful measurement reveals that it participates in movements so gradual that centuries must pass before changes become visible to human perception. The stars that compose it are themselves moving through space at speeds that would terrify us if we experienced them directly. Yet from our vantage point, they create an impression of perfect stability. The metaphor carries implications that extend far beyond astronomy into realms where spiritual guidance must address circumstances that no previous generation encountered in exactly the same form. The temple itself participates in transformations that operate according to timescales that individual lives can witness only partially. Changes that require responses based upon understanding that transcends immediate experience while remaining grounded in practical wisdom that can address actual rather than merely theoretical challenges. Months accumulate into years that carry Khaemwaset deeper into his role as keeper of traditions that must learn to live within circumstances that seem designed to test every assumption upon which those traditions have been based. Foreign administrators visit the temple with increasing frequency, their inspections courteous but thorough, their questions revealing interest in temple resources and activities that goes beyond mere academic curiosity about Egyptian religious practices. They speak Egyptian with competence that suggests serious study, yet their accent carries undertones that remind listeners of different linguistic roots, alternative ways of organizing sound and meaning that reflect different approaches to fundamental questions about existence and purpose. These officials express appreciation for the temple's architectural beauty and historical significance, while making recommendations about efficiency and contemporary relevance that strike Egyptian ears as missing essential points about the relationship between sacred and practical functions. Their suggestions for modernization and streamlining reflect administrative philosophy that measures value primarily through quantifiable results, creating tension with approaches that recognize effectiveness in phenomena that resist precise measurement or immediate demonstration. Khaemwaset learns to navigate these interactions with diplomacy that preserves temple autonomy while acknowledging realities that no amount of religious authority can simply dismiss or override. He discovers that some foreign concepts can actually illuminate aspects of Egyptian wisdom that familiarity has rendered invisible, while other innovations threaten to dissolve essential elements that must be protected even at considerable cost, inconvenience, or efficiency. The challenge becomes developing discrimination that can distinguish between helpful adaptation and destructive compromise. The festival of Khnum, when it arrives in his 43rd year, draws smaller crowds than any in living memory, yet those who attend bring intensity of devotion that transforms reduced numbers into concentrated spiritual experience. The procession that once filled entire streets now moves through spaces that seem vast by comparison. Yet the quality of attention that participants bring to their involvement creates atmosphere of intimacy that allows for forms of connection that larger gatherings had made difficult to achieve. Standing beside the sacred bark, as it makes its ceremonial journey through streets where foreign merchants pause to observe rituals whose meaning they cannot fully comprehend, yet whose beauty commands respect that transcends cultural boundaries. Khaemwaset recognizes that transformation need not mean diminishment, that what appears to be ending may actually represent beginning of forms too subtle for conventional measurement to register or evaluate accurately. The hymns that rise from fewer throats carry notes that seem to penetrate deeper into silence than massive choruses achieved, their reduced volume creating space for harmonies that had been overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of sound that earlier festivals generated. Children who participate bring questions that reflect their exposure to diverse traditions and influences, their innocence complicated by awareness that makes their faith more rather than less profound, because it has been chosen, rather than simply inherited from circumstances that provided no alternatives for consideration. As his 50th year approaches, Khaemwaset begins to experience moments of recognition that feel like preparation for transitions, whose exact nature remains unclear, yet whose approach can be sensed like approaching weather in changes of atmospheric pressure that sensitive individuals detect before obvious signs become visible to ordinary observation. His body shows signs of accumulated service in joints that require more attention and care, in energy that must be managed more carefully to sustain activities that youth had accomplished without conscious effort or planning. Yet these physical limitations seem to be accompanied by spiritual capacities that compensate through depth for what they may lack in raw power or endurance. His understanding of ritual has evolved beyond mere technical competence into intuitive recognition of how form serves function, while function transforms form through practice that remains alive rather than mechanical. His prayers carry authority that derives from decades of conversation with silence that has gradually revealed its capacity for response through means that defy conventional expectations about divine communication. The young priests who now serve under his guidance represent hope for continuity that will preserve essential elements while adapting surface features to serve new circumstances that require new approaches without abandoning fundamental principles that make spiritual development possible under any conditions that consciousness may encounter. They bring fresh perspective that illuminates aspects of traditional wisdom that familiarity had rendered invisible, while their questions force articulation of insights that might otherwise remain trapped in forms of knowledge too subtle for verbal expression. The seasons turn and Khaemwaset enters his 60th year, his hair silver as moonlight on the Nile, his movements deliberate as temple ritual itself. The morning prayers flow from his lips with authority earned through decades of faithful service, each word weighted with understanding that transforms routine into sacred act. Khenti now leads the younger initiates, his voice carrying echoes of lessons learned on starlit rooftops. The temple breathes with quieter rhythms, yet its pulse remains strong, concentrated like incense distilled to its essential fragrance. 3 priests maintain what once required dozens, their devotion burning brighter for its scarcity. Standing in the courtyard where lotus pools reflect eternal stars, Khaemwaset recognizes the truth that eluded his younger self. The gods never departed. They withdrew their obvious presence to teach humanity a deeper faith, one that required no miracles to sustain its flame. In silence, he had learned to hear their whispers. In emptiness, he discovered their fullness. The sacred staff passes to younger hands as he retreats to his small chamber, papyrus scrolls containing his insights carefully sealed for future seekers. His breathing synchronizes with the temple's ancient stones, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the river that flows eternal beyond these walls. As dawn approaches on what will be his final morning, Khaemwaset smiles with profound peace. The gods speak through continuity itself, through young voices chanting old prayers, through hands that tend sacred flames, through consciousness that refuses to let wonder die despite the world's transformations. The Nile flows on, carrying prayers toward eternity.